Hi and welcome to the SQL Bits 2020 virtual session on tips and tricks for working with finance data. My name is Rishi. I'm a principal consultant at Altius, a data and AI company in the UK, now part of Avanade. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and I'm a chartered accountant by background. I run two main communities at the moment, LearnDataInsights.com, which is all around helping people prepare for Microsoft exams, such as the Power BI Idea 100 with quizzes and courses, and PowerPlatformFinance.com, where we run fortnightly webinars on topics related to Power Platform, so Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, as applied in the finance sector. So lots of interesting webinars there if you want to go and check those out. In this particular session, we're going to look at working with finance data in Power BI. So looking at an income statement report that I've linked to here, where this blog post series also contains instructions on how to build out the first page of this report. So we're going to focus on a few of those and look at particular details such as building the income statement hierarchy and telling the story with the data. So whilst I think it'll be useful for people who work with finance data or in the finance sector, I think it also has broad application across anyone who really works with Power BI. So I hope you find the session useful, and do please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. So almost everything I'm going to show today is included on a 5-part community blog that I wrote on the Power BI community, and I'll include a link to that here and below, and also at the end of the session. And this goes through, you can download the data and download the solution files, and it goes through how to build out this income statement report step by step. And a lot of those steps I'm going to kind of go through and talk about why they're important today and how to do them. So I'm going to give a high level overview, but anything you want to go back to, have a look on here. I'm going to start with just looking at what that data looks like. So we've got a transaction table and monthly. So if we look at the files, we can see that we've got in this session in here, we've got finance data, and we can see that we've got all of these monthly results files. So these CSV files all along here. For each month, and we've got some reference data tables. So this is what the monthly data looks like. So we've got our keys, so date, month, organization, scenarios. These are all the keys that link into our reference data tables. And then we've got amount and amount in USD. And then we've got our reference data, and these in the different tabs. So each of the account keys that was in the transaction table, what the account is, the account type, header assignment, subheader, dates, departments, headers, organizations, and scenarios, and we'll have a look at these in more detail. And then if we were trying to do this in Excel, one of the things I showed in a video, which I'll link to in here, is how you'd potentially look at trying to build an income statement in Excel using sum-if formulas against the table or against all the data, and some really messy formulas, and sometimes you'll quite struggle with, especially with large volumes of data. So we could do much better in Power BI, and that's what we're going to show next. So we're going to start with our data already loaded into Power BI for purposes of saving time. If you want to see how we did this, have a look at the first part of that blog. So here's our data. We have our transactional data that we saw loaded in from Excel, all of those monthly files. And then we have all of our reference data tables joined into that fact table, into that transaction table with one-to-many relationships. So this is what's known as the star schema. We've actually got a slight snowflake here by joining two dimensions, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. And if we look at then our tables, so we have our finance data. So this is for every single month. So we connected to folder, so we could bring in all the month's data into one query. We then have scenario key, account key, amount USD, and we've added a calculated column here to give us our finance amount in USD times the sign column, which is coming from the related table, dim accounts. So if we have a look at dim accounts, so this is joined on the account key, and if we look at dim accounts here, we have the account keys. It has the name of the account, the sign, so whether it's positive or negative, i.e. whether it's a debit or credit for the income statement, so 1 or -1, and that's what we're using here. We're bringing in, looking up, doing a lookup against the account key and returning a sign. And then here, this is the first tip of this series, which is where we have an account hierarchy. So we have an account key, we have a name, and then we have, say, subheader. So we can say payroll taxes is part of labor expenses, which is part of operating expenses, which is a type of expenditure. So this hierarchy here will really help us in building out this income statement. So what we can do is drag these headings in as a hierarchy. And actually, if we go back into dim headers, we'll see actually this header assignment here, operating expenses. And this dim headers contains all of our financial statement, income statement lines. So all the lines we need with an order. And this is quite important because we have the header in here and we sort it by order. And calculation type and detail we'll come back to in future steps. But we have our dim headers joined into a header assignment in dim accounts. So this hierarchy is really going to help us build the income statement. And let's have a go at doing that. So if we drag on to, let's create a matrix visual. And we've got this amount with sign column. I'm just going to drag this onto values. This is what's called creating an implicit measure. So it's not best practice, but what we'll do, we'll drag that into values, and then we'll drag our header into rows. And then here's where we're creating the hierarchy by dragging multiple fields in. So we've got header, and then from there, we've got subheader, and we can go from there into account. And let's just do some formatting on this. So let's go to row headers. Let's increase the size of this, say to 14. Oops, 14. And let's put on the plus minus icons here as well. So then it looks a bit like a pivot table. And let's also increase the size of the values. And now we can see we have our first income statement. Actually, one last thing we can do as well is subtotals. So rather than call that total, let's call that profit after tax, because that's essentially what it represents, is our revenue less our expenses, is our profit after tax. And we can see here we have our first income statement. So we have got revenue, cost of sales, operating expenses, and we could drill down the hierarchy. Because we've got this account hierarchy, we can drill down revenue, break down that 200 million into gross sales, discounts, and returns and adjustments. So actually we can see we've got some negative numbers in revenue as well as we break it down, and then we can drill down those any further if they go down. So we've got our first income statement, great achievement, just achieved by having an account hierarchy. So tip number 2 is to build up measure chains. And as we said in the last tip, when we dragged on a column into the values bucket, it creates an implicit measure. And this is not best practice. It's better to explicitly define our calculations. So we can do that by creating measures. So if we go into our finance data, we can see here we've got the amount assigned column, but let's create a measure. So a new measure here, and let's call this total amount and make that the sum of finance data and amount with sign. And now we can use this total amount in here, and it should give us exactly the same values. Yep, and it's just this is exactly what the implicit measure is doing as well, but we've now explicitly said we want to sum it this column. And the reason we need to define these explicit measures is because we want to build upon this. So let's go through and look at then where else we can take this. So actually this number doesn't really make any sense, because what we're doing is summing together actuals and budget and all years and all periods. So it's just a big number that doesn't mean anything. So actually we can't sum together actuals and budgets. So let's create a new measure that's going to use that measure. So it's going to say, now let's say total actuals, for example, or actuals equals. So we're going to start with our total amount, but what we want to do is say take the total amount, but only where our scenario is actual. So we need to modify what's called the filter context. So we can do calculate total amount, and here we pass in a filter condition. So if we do dim scenario equals actual, And what this will do is give us our total amount, so the sum of that finance amount with sign, but for where the scenario is actual. So this is then going to give us our actuals, and we can now drag on actuals in here instead, and actually that makes more sense than just total amount. And then the other thing we can do now then is start to again build upon those measures. So we've got our actuals number here, and what we can do is build another measure that says, actually, I want my actuals for each of these GL lines, but I want this time to show it for last year. Now, what we're able to do is do this really simply within Power BI using time intelligence. And this is enabled because we have a date table. We have a table that has got all our continuous dates in there, so no gaps in the dates, and all the attributes of those dates, and that's something we can just bring in and use almost in every report that we build. Always best practice to have. And then with the table, we click on here, mark as date table. So because we've got those two set up, we can now actually just say calculate. So again, we want to modify the filter context, so give us our actuals, but give it to us for that same period last year. So whatever date that we're looking at in context, so would we select a month or a year, this is going to give us our prior year values. And here it needs to make sure that we've got that date table, that continuous set of dates. So here is where we can just do dim dates date and close bracket. So we're calculating our actuals for the same period last year, and this is our actuals prior year measure. And we can go on and start to build out some other measures that just again build on these. So say our variance to prior year, and that's just going to be our actuals less our actuals prior year. And we can also even just build one called variance to prior year percentage, and here we can do divide our variance to prior year divided by our actuals prior year, and this is going to just give us our variance to prior year percentage. And the idea of building these measure chains is now actually we don't need to show all of the sub calculations that go beneath them. If we want to, we can just show variance to prior year percentage, and let's format that as percentage. So let's click on there, measure tools, click on the percentage icon, and now we can just see the variance to percentage. And actually something like that might be quite good to show, for example, in a bar chart where we can see which ones have the highest, which account lines have the highest variance to percentage, and we can actually sort those by variance to percentage. And we can see, for example, operating centers expenses has the highest variance. But what we'll do here, let's drag on in our income statement, let's drag on all of them. So let's do actuals. We want actuals prior year, and we want variance to prior year and variance to prior year percentage. And one last thing as well, these numbers don't look particularly neat. They don't look like how accountants format their numbers. So what we can do is apply a custom format string to those. So we can actually take these custom format strings from Excel. So if we go into Excel, we have a number, we can click on here, and then in this string here, this is the kind of string that we need to take. So we need to take one that's going to work with Power BI. And then we come back into here and we can go and select our measures. So in the modeling view now of Power BI, we can hold down Control here, select multiple measures, total amount and variance to prior year. And let's give them all a custom format string. So we do format in here, custom, and enter the format string that we want in there. So let's see if that one, and you'll take it from the PowerPoint deck, write them in there. And now back in Power BI, enter the format string, and now we can see it's formatting them exactly how we want, with no decimal places, with a pound sign and comma, and now this looks much neater. So this tip is to show our periods dynamically. Now you might have noticed when we put this income statement report together that actually we've got actuals and actuals prior year, but prior year to what? What year are we actually looking at, or which month are we looking at? And actually, this is all of the data. So this is 5 years worth of data, and essentially this is 4 years worth of data, or whatever it is. So what we can do is we can focus this on a specific month or year, and that will be able to give us the right context. So we can give us the actuals for that year, and then the value for the same period last year. So for the given month, say, and then for that same period what it was last year. So that would make much more sense. So now if we go into, if we just want to add, say, a slicer, and we can add in our dates, we can now add multiple fields into a slicer and it will give it to us as a hierarchy. So we can do year, and let's do this as a drop down. So we click on here, let's drop down, and actually let's also drag on then month. So that's not going to work as a drop down anymore. Let's do it as a list, and now we can see here, and let's just increase the values. And let's actually put on single select. So we only want to make sure we've got either a single year or a single month selected. And let's click on the labels here and make this slightly bigger. So items even. And let's make that 14 as well. So now we can see here we've got the whole of 2008 selected. So now this is showing us our 2008 actuals and our 2017 actuals. Or if we were selecting a particular month, then this would show us our March 2008 actuals and our March 2007 in the prior year, and the variance of the percentage. So now this makes a lot more sense. But actually, what if we wanted to just kind of either look at monthly numbers or quarter to date or year to date? We'd have to keep changing the selections, and it would be quite annoying, I think, to have to do that. So one of the things we can do is create a dynamic month to date, quarter to date, year to date values, and we can actually have a slicer where they select either MTD, QTD, or YTD. The challenge is we don't have a table that has those values in there, and we can't put a measure on a slicer. So even if we were to create a measure with those three values somehow, we would be able to do that. But what we can do is we can just put them into a new table that we can create with those values. And it doesn't have to be part of the data model in terms of relationships or anything, but we can just call it here period. So we just go to enter data. So from the home tab, we click on enter data, create a table, and we just create it with these values: month to date, quarter to date, year to date. If we want to, for them to appear in a particular order, we can also add an order column there as well. And let's just call this period selection, and load that into the data model. And now what it's done is it's loaded, I already had one in there, apologies, but it's loaded a period selection table in there, which is just a disconnected table. So there's no relationships we can create between this and anything else. So let's just leave it disconnected. But we can still use it as part of the header. So we can drag period on here. So as part of a slicer. So we could drag period in there, make it a slicer, and actually let's make it look a bit like buttons. So we can do under general, orientation, vertical, and let's give a background with white text, and now they're starting to look a little bit like buttons. So we can format our slices to look like that. Let's take off the header, and now we've got the month to date, quarter to date, year to date selected. Now the challenge is this isn't going to impact any of our data in our income statement here because we've got no relationships. It's just a disconnected table. So what we'll have to do is actually create a new measure that actually looks at what's been selected in here. So actually what's really important is to make sure on here that we do selection controls and make sure we have single select enabled. And this will make sure then there's only ever going to be only one value selected. And that means we can actually, I'm just going to change this background to be a bit lighter so it's a bit easier to see what we've got selected there. This makes sure that we've got one and only one value selected in here, and that means that we can then use it as part of the measure. So let's do that. So now what we can do is create a new measure, and let's call this actuals by period. And here we're going to start using things called variables. So it's just a way for us to break up our code a bit to make it easier to read, a bit easier to understand. So give it a name, and we're going to call this selected period. And what we can use here is the selected value. So we can only use this when we know that a column is going to return only one value. If it doesn't, we have to give it a default, essentially, in alternate result. So here we can do selected value and period selection period. So we want to pick out the value that's selected. So remember, that's a column because we put that as a new table, disconnected table, and put it as our slicer. And we shouldn't get any alternate result because on this page, at least, we've got a single select slicer. But just in case we're using this on another page, let's default it to month to date. So now we've got our selected period. Now what we need to do is return a different measure based on what's been selected in the slicer. So we do on the return, and we can use a switch statement here. So a switch statement, a switch function allows us to be able to look at a value, and for any combination of any possible value that's in a formula, or in this case in a variable, we can return a corresponding result. So we start with the expression. So we want to look at selected period, and then it says, well, for each value, what do we want to return? So let's say if we want to return month to date. So now what we need to do is return our monthly numbers. So again, we want to return actuals, but again, what we want to do is return the monthly actuals to make sure it's just for the month that's selected. So if we do calculate actuals, and now we can do we could use a function called dates mtd. So dates mtd is going to give us exactly what we want. So for the period that we've got selected, so if we've got March selected, it will give us all the dates for that month. And again, it's asking us for our calendar table, for our date table. So if we do dim dates, date again, we can then pass that in. And that's our statement for month to date. And then it's very similar for the other three. So if it's quarter to date, we want to do calculate actuals and do dates QTD. So all of these functions are kind of shortcut functions built in for us already. And again, we could do dim dates date, so we pass in our calendar table. And then for year to date, we do calculate actuals, dates YTD. And then our last result has to be if none of those are true. So essentially if nothing's selected, or and again, we shouldn't do this because we've defaulted to month to date, but let's just put actuals in as our kind of catch-all value if else. So we need that last condition in there for this switch statement to work. So we've got actuals by period, we've got selected value period selection, so this is what's been selected from our slicer. We've then got based on what's returned, so if MTD has been selected in slicer, return the actuals calculated in the dates MTD context. Otherwise, if it's QTD, calculate our actuals in dates QTD context. Otherwise, YTD, calculate in the dates YTD context. So that's going to work now. And what we can do then is we can still have our slicer, or we can have one of those. And now in here, let's put in replace our value in here with, rather than actuals, do actuals by period. And actually, let's change our measures and do, rather than referring to actuals, refer to actuals by period. So in our prior year, it gives us our actuals by period, same period last year. And I think that should be it. And the variance is going to be actuals by period divided by actuals prior year, and the other measure built on this, so that's fine. And now this is going to give us our values. So at the moment it's giving us our monthly values for, say, March, or for any given month. And then if we do quarter to date, now these are quarterly values. And if we did year to date, they're yearly values, which for March is going to be the same thing for quarter to date and year to date. But if we do June, for example, now we can start to see they're actually different. And actually, let's just go back and format. So we pick out our format from here, our actuals, pick out our format number string, and let's just make sure that our other two measures are formatted in the same way. So let's go to custom and enter the format string in there. And now we've got a fully dynamic income statement that's showing in the way that we want when we're selecting a year and a month, and it will give us the actuals for that month to date, quarter to date, or year to date, and for the same period last year, and the variance and the percentage variance. Great, so now we have our income statement, but our next tip is to enable us to actually show it like an income statement is formatted. And one of the main differences between what we've got now and how an income statement should look is the omission of subtotals here. So when we develop an income statement, we have revenue, cost of sales, and then we have the gross profit or the gross margin underneath that. And then we have operating expenses, other expenses, and we might have another subtotal that says profit before tax or profit after operating expenses. And actually, if I show you an example of how an income statement looks, we can see here, for example, we've got net revenue, net sales, and then we've got cost of sales, and then gross profit. And this gross profit is that minus that, or if that one's negative, then the sum of those two above it. And then we have operating expenses. Again, if these were negative, the operating income will be a subtotal of all of the subtotals above it. So this is what we would achieve, for example, using the subtotal function in Excel. So very easy to do in Excel, slightly more complicated in Power BI, but just forces you to think a little bit about how Power BI works from a DAX perspective. So actually, if we go back into our headers, we can see we actually have those header lines in here. And this tip is when you have a table that has all of your lines in there, including subtotals. You'll see there's nothing shown under that, and we'll come back to why that is in a moment, but we've got them here in terms of an order. So we've got revenue, net sale, cost of sales, gross margin, and then we've got calculation type. And one, it basically indicates that it comes from an FS line, so it's part of the header assignment. So we'll have accounts with a header assignment of revenue, and here we'll have accounts with a header assignment of net sales. And cost of sales. And then the calc type 2 indicates that this is a subtotal. So net sales is a subtotal of revenue. Gross margin is a subtotal of revenue and cost of sales. So obviously excluding the other subtotals and so on. So let's go back to our income statement here. And firstly, let's have a look at actually what happens if we show why we don't see those totals in here, because we dragged on header, and yet we don't see all of the rows for header. We only see revenue, cost of sales, operating expenses. We don't see any of those subtotal lines. And the reason for that is because those subtotal lines have no data against them, because we're bringing data in from our transaction table. And so when those filters flow through the transaction table, it's saying that there's no data against them. So this is why if we go into here, and we go into header and we do show items with no data, now we can see they're actually coming up. So we've got net sales, but it's blank. We've got gross margin, but it's blank. And the reason it's blank is because there's no rows in the transaction table that relates to a header of gross margin. So actually what we need to do is do it as a calculation. So actually, it's a separate calculation for these rows. Now, if these were all custom calculations, then we could potentially have a DAX measure that says, look at what the name of this is, and if it's gross margin, do this calculation. If it's operating profit, do this calculation, and then we can have a dynamic measure like we did for the period selection to be able to show things here. Now, we can do slightly simpler than that, because if we actually look at these headers, we've got an order column. So actually, we can do, the order of all of those less than the current. So actually, we can say cost of sales is going to be anything with an order less than, gross margin is going to be anything less than order less than 4. So it's going to sum through 1, 2, and 3, and 2 will be blank in the context we calculated, so it'll just be the 1 and the 3. And then we can do the same thing with operating profit. We can say, give me the subtotal of anything with an order less than 6. So let's firstly just pick out that order. So how do we know what the order is for each row on here? Now, when we had a slicer selection, we used selected value. And actually we could use the same thing here, because even though we're not selected a value, so it's not selected value in the literal sense, it's the value in the current filter context. So if we did here in revenue, we will be able to pull out the selected value, which is the value in the current filter context, off that row in that table, in our headers table. So if we go into here now and we do, let's just create a new measure. And let's call this totals. So let's just do order for header in current filter context. Just, I'm going to make this really explicit, just so we're clear on this call. We don't need to call it out in real life. So let's call this selected value. So we want to do the selected value, even though it's not filtered from there, and then do dim headers order. And this is going to give us the order number for that header in this filter context. So now if we drag on this field in here, we can see it's expanded everything out. We've got number 1 for revenue, we've got 2 for net sales, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we've got a blank for profit after tax. And actually what we can do, we can do that as maybe we want that to be the highest number that exists, the highest order number. So for profit after tax, so back in our order for header and current filter context, selected value, and then we can do max dim headers. So if it's not, there's not 1 in filter context, so this always means there's 1 value in the filter context, either from a slicer selection or say rows against a table or axes against a chart. So here we say whatever that order number is, we do that. If this alternate result, so i.e. if we don't have 1 value in filter context, then we can do the maximum value. So dim headers order, and that should give us 9 there as well, which is the highest number. So again, that will be net income there. We've already got a total in it here, but otherwise they'll be the same thing. So we can actually get rid of totals on this, but even if we didn't, we could do it this way. So now we need to have a formula that's going to basically say to us do a running total. So it's very much like a cumulative total that we have, say, for dates, and there's lots of patterns out there for cumulative totals. We need to follow a very similar pattern for our running total here. So we say for gross margin, give us a subtotal of the 1 and the 3. So anything less than those. And then again for operating profit, we can say we want anything where the order number is less than 6. So anything in those. So now let's go back to our orders on here, and let's just create a new measure that's going to be able to do that for us. So now if we do actuals by period running total. So firstly, what you want to do is work out what that order number is that's in the current filter context. So we just created a measure for that. So current order number, header order number, maybe we should call it current header order number, otherwise we're thinking of sales orders or something. Current header order number equals, and we can just refer to the measure order for the header in the current filter context. And now what we want to do is calculate. So we want to return our actuals by period, but we want to calculate it for where our order number in dim headers is less than our current header order number. So now we've got our formula there. So we've got current header order number is just is our selected value. Return actuals by period, calculate, so give us our actuals by period in the filter context of where our dim headers order is less than our current header order number. Now, the challenge is anytime we refer to something like this, we're also looking at it in the current filter context. So this will give us on row 1, where we've got revenue, that will give us 1. And it will say 1 is less than 1 because that's our current. And then it will say 2 is less than 2. 3 is less than 3. And because we do less than, it will actually give us blanks. So what we need to do is to say, calculate that, but actually consider the whole headers table, not just the current row that I've got selected. So we can bring in another thing in there, another filter condition for all dim headers. So calculate actuals by period in the context of all of our header table and calculate for where the order is less than the current header order number. And now that should give us our running total. So it's a very similar pattern to what we use for cumulative totals. And if we drag that into here, we should be able to see that this is giving us the right running total. So 7 million, and then we go down to we've got a value there, a loss there of 2 million. So we start with 7 million, which is our revenue, then hit a loss of 2 million in cost of sales, a negative number. So now we go down, our running total gets down to 5 million. We've got a cost of operating expenses of 3 million. So then our running total goes down to 1.8 million. And so on, and then taxes, and it goes down to 1395. So what we want to do now, we've got this running total, but we want to show essentially exact when the calc type is 1, i.e. when it's coming from our account lines, it's got a relationship to our dim account, so return something, then return whatever it's going to return. In those rows where it was blank, essentially, where we've got a different calc type, then we can say return the running total. And then, so we have a dynamic measure. So we're going to use another dynamic measure very similar to what we did there. And let's just go back to our dim headers table. So we've got calc type, and let's just create a new measure based on that as well. So now we've got actuals, running total, or account sum, accounts. So firstly, what we can do is say, let's just pick out a variable that says what is our current calc type. Current calc type equals, and again, we can do selected value, or we could do, let's do selected value. So selected value, calc type, dim headers calc type. And if nothing, as an alternative, we'll just give it, again, the max calc type. So this is going to return us either 1 or 2. All right, so now we can do current calc type. So if it's 1, then we want to just do our actuals by period. So if it's coming from the accounts, we could just give it our actuals by period and it'll calculate that. If it's a number 2, then we can give it our running total, actuals by period running total. And if it's none of those, let's just return blank. So now we've got our actuals running total. So we just based it on the calc type, and then we give it a 1. If it's coming from, if it's a line like revenue, we just pick up our revenue totals. If it's a line like gross margin, then we give it the running total calculation that we just did on there. And now running total or accounts, you drag that in there. Let's take off these others. And here, now we should have our net. So here, then we have in our top headings, we have revenue. Net sales is the same because we've got nothing else that's coming under there. Cost of sales is negative number, so then our gross margin is that number there. And operating expenses, operating profit, other income expenses. So we probably wouldn't have this as a drill through on here. We'd have it as a kind of fixed format statement, so we can turn off those headers and just keep the header line. And then we've got revenue 7 million, cost of sales, gross margin. And that then that allows us then to be able to have our kind of fixed format income statement. So this tip is about telling a story through data visualization with finance data. And this is definitely one of the most important parts. And by the time you've got to this stage of visualizing and thinking about how to present it, often you're so fed up with all the work you've had to do before to get this logic, these measures working with DAX and get your data in there that somehow this gets a little bit neglected. And that's a big mistake, because this is a really, really important area. So the overall goal with data visualization is to reduce cognitive load. You want to make it as easy as possible for the people consuming your report to know exactly what it's telling them, what they need to do, and why, what's driving it. So is their performance good or bad? This is what you need to answer as soon as you look at the report. Is the performance good or bad? How good or bad? And why? What can I do about it? So that's really what we need to try and get to. So in terms of how you get that across with a design, for start, it needs to be really simple and uncluttered. So have as few visuals as you can on the page, and that will also help performance, which is part of user experience. So limit the number of visuals and make those visuals that you have simple and effective. So stick with bar charts, line charts, tables with conditional formatting, rather than just pure tables. So, but things that really help to people know how to interpret and how to understand. Lots of these snazzy new custom visuals, it increases cognitive load. People need to figure out how to interpret them, and that's what you want to try and avoid. So if we have a look at the report that we've got here, and this is just an example of a report that I built. It's not by any means the best report, and to copy exactly how it is. There's definitely things that could be improved on here. But one of the things you'll notice is that it's quite obvious what the key metrics are for what you're looking at. So we're looking at month to date, you're looking at monthly numbers, or you're looking at yearly numbers, and you can see, yep, revenue's up, gross profit's up, profit before tax is down, and profit after tax is down. So by quite a lot. So actually we're looking at probably our operating expenses we can see is going to be a major area that we need to focus on. And we can see, even looking at the waterfall chart where we're looking at profit after tax, we can see that European operations is the biggest contributor to that. So we can see at a glance where everything is, and we can also see, looking at our variances, for example, if we looked at measure comparison, we can see the variances and which ones have positive and negative variances. So we're using color here as well, and this is the idea, to use color to draw attention. So use it sparingly, don't overuse color, don't have rainbow charts, and use it to draw attention to the right thing. So use simple colors, so we've got here red and green for positive or favorable and unfavorable, and just use those to highlight favorable or unfavorable results. Something very simple color pattern like that. Everything else keep as neutral colors like grays and things like that. So let's have a look at, we start with, as I say, looking at what our numbers are showing, what our headline metrics are. And with the headline metrics, again, one of the things we really need to bring out with this to know as soon as someone's looking at this report is not just the number, because you can see here it says revenue was 1.54 million. And that begs the question, well, so what? Is that good or is that bad? How do I know what it was compared last year? I don't remember off the top of my head. Am I supposed to remember that and then associate that to tell me whether that number is good or bad? So we need to have context here, and this is where we've got these arrows. So up and down arrows. So up being the number's gone up, and down meaning it's gone down, and then red or green to say whether that increase or decrease is favorable or unfavorable. Now for all of these, an increase is always favorable because they're all credits. So revenue, gross profit, profit before tax, and profit after tax. If they've gone up, it's good. If they've gone down, it's bad. For the income statement, we had to apply some conditional formatting that was slightly more complicated, because some of those, it could depend, right? So if it's cost of sales, or if it's a cost number, if that's gone down, that's good. So what we needed to do here was, on the conditional formatting, is look at the sign that's used. So we've got against the header or against the account lines, we've got the sign that's used, and then we make a call on whether a positive or negative increase is good or bad. But for these, so to do these arrows, these are just card visuals, so they're all just card visuals on here. And the arrow is from measure delta arrow. So we have the delta, and I've done these measures dynamically with a disconnected table, so it's a similar pattern to what we saw in the previous tips. We look at that delta, and if it's greater than 0, if it's positive, then we use the unicard character for an up arrow. Otherwise, we use the unicard character for a down arrow, and that's what we have there. And then we have the delta, and then the conditional formatting on this is if we just go to data label, and we can see it's just on that same delta, so it's either positive or negative number. If it's a positive number, then green. If it's a negative number, then red. So just very simple conditional formatting for that. So instead it gets slightly more complicated with the income statement, but you can go and check that out. So that now then gives us our 4 key heading metrics there, along with the context for whether that performance is good or bad. So we can see at a glance how well we're doing. The other kind of tip is to focus on variances, because the variances is what's telling a really interesting story here. It's not so much about what our numbers are and absolute numbers that might be interesting, but what's going to drive people coming back to this report over and over again and telling them something that they don't already know is really what are those real variances, or where are those variances coming from? If we know that we're up 100k or we're down 100k this month, why? What are the real drivers behind that? Is it particular regions? Is it particular products? Is it particular customers? Where are our metrics that would drive that number to go up or down? What do they look like? So that's why this variance is really important, because it's something that's going to draw attention and be interesting to your audience. So we have the variances brought out through the up and down arrows and through the colors, and also through use of a waterfall chart. Now, waterfall charts are great because they really show that movement in balances, and that's typically what they're used for, to show how did you go from here to here and what were the major contributors in the middle. And this is why finance folk love waterfall charts, because they tell a really interesting story just from a very simple visual that's easy to interpret. So I've adapted that same idea and used it for income statement, which obviously isn't balances, but we could still have a starting number or contextual number to start, and then a number that we're looking at either month to date, quarter to date, or year to date. So we can see here we've got month to date, and this is showing for net profit. We can see our month to date was 250k, so that's our current month, and then we've got prior month, and then the difference between those two, which ones have had the biggest positive difference and which ones have had the biggest negative difference. And we can see straight away where those regions are contributing to that increase or decrease in overall profit after tax. And then if we switch that for quarter to date, we can see that again, we've got our quarter to date number, so where we've ended up with 39,436. And then our starting number, we've done the first full month of the quarter. So this is May. That will be April's number. So if we did this for April, we'll just end up with the same number. First full month of quarter to date is the same. It's the same month for April, and we're only looking at monthly data here. Whereas for May, it's the first full month versus quarter to date. And then if we look at year to date, it's the first full month of the year, so January. So January's total profit compared to the year to date profit for up till May, and then for the difference between those two numbers, which are the biggest contributors towards that. And so this is quite interesting. And where it starts to now then give you, so it gives you very good information at a glance for profit after tax, which is your key headline. And where it gets really interesting is where we start to use cross filtering to tell that story. So we've already got the story of whether our performance is good or bad. And then we want to know why. Why is it good or bad? So actually what we can start to do then is hone in on things that look interesting to us. So for example, this European operations looks quite interesting because we can see our profit before tax is down and profit after tax is down overall. And then we can see straight away from here that European operations is the biggest contributor to that. In fact, it's the only contributor because the other 3 regions actually reported an increase in profit during that period. So if we now then a positive profit. So we can see heavy losses in here. So when we click on European operations, now this entire page shows just for European operations. So we have a European operation specific income statement where we can see exactly how that profit after tax number has been made up. So is it revenues, and we can compare those to prior year. Is it costs that have gone up, and again we can compare those to prior years, so we can see, and then we can drill down into those individual levels of detail, focused on European operations. And here we can see at a high level, again, it's operating costs, because our revenue and gross profit have both gone up compared to last year for European operations. But again, its profit before tax has gone down. So there's something really going on here with this. And we can see, actually, just looking at this, our prior year was 656k for European operations, our operating expenses, and this year is 1.774 million. So we can drill into that detail and see what's driving that. So that's one way of cross filtering. So again, you can hone in on a specific data point that's interesting. So think about your visuals that you have on a page and those cross interactions that you have, those visual interactions. Really try and get those right, and think about those in advance, and a storyboard and a user journey. And then we've got here the cross interaction going the other way as well. So we've got, we're focusing there on a particular region, and we're looking at profit after tax. But actually, if this is now looking interesting just from a revenue perspective, and perhaps even for the regional generally, we can click on revenue, and now this waterfall chart's showing us our revenue number and how it was for the first full month. In January, it was 772, and then our total year to date was 6.6 million. So then which regions have contributed most to that increase? And obviously you wouldn't expect to see the decreases here, because that represents 11 months of data, and that represents 1 month. But in those 11 months, where's been the biggest increases? So this is, using these cross interactions, these visual interactions, really allow the user to be able to dig into that why story. And then make sure everything's simple, and make sure everything's easy to use and obvious. And the last thing on here is think about the user journey from the perspective of navigation, or what they want to see. So people might want to see slightly different variations on things depending on their purpose. And actually, the income statement is a perfect example of this, because if we have different income statements we might want to see. So actually we said, well, you might want to see it as a fixed format with all of those subtotals that we looked at in the last tip, where it's got gross margin and net sales. And we can see we don't have the drill down capability, but we can see there's like a properly formatted income statement. We might want to just look at the individual lines and drill into all of those details to say revenue, discounts, gross sales. We want to be able to drill it. This is the in and out drill through hierarchy, and actually we want to see all the measures related to those. Or we might want to see a grid style where we've got, say, region across the top and your FS lines down the side. Now, again, the only thing that's changing with these visuals is just that one table. Everything else is staying the same. So any other filter selections I've got, any other cross-filtering selections I've made, apart from this income statement, will apply, and I can see the income statement in those three views. So that was set up using bookmarks. So if we go to bookmarks, you'll see that each three of these are linked to a specific bookmark. So the first one to IS formatted, the second one to IS measure comparison, and the third one to IS country table. And clicking on these bookmarks then shows the effect of those buttons. Now, what we've done to create those bookmarks is change the visibility of particular matrices. So created 3 copies of that matrix, 3 visuals, brought them all onto the same page, and then when adding the bookmark, just set the toggle for each one's of visibility. So this one has each one will have 2 income statements hidden and 1 visible. So this one's got these 2 hidden, and it's got the measure comparison one visible, and then the opposite one, it's got the country one visible here, and then the other 2 income statements hidden. Capture those as bookmarks, and then link the bookmarks to the buttons. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea how to be able to tell a story with this. And it's really important to think about the questions that you want to answer with this up front. Write those questions down, validate those questions with your audience, and only try to aim your report at a very specific audience. Don't try and be all things to all people. Build that report based on that storyboard. Think about those visual interactions. Think about that journey. Think about that journey of starting with, is my performance good or bad? How good or bad is it? Why? and then what can I do about it? With that in mind, you can't go too far wrong with data visualization. So for the last tip, I want to show you through some PowerPoint slides that will be more effective in the interest of time, and I'll cover a separate session on later on. But before we get to that, let's recap on where we've got to so far in the presentation, what we've covered, and what some of those tips have been to be able to take away for your own reports. So we started with a demo of financial reporting in Excel, very high level. There's more detail on that in some other things. So the first tip was to use an account hierarchy. And this was really then taking your account table and making sure you have attributes such as the subheader and header that reflect what you want to be able to drill down on your income statement for. So just have those as attributes, as columns in your account, have an account hierarchy, and that will allow you to be able to generate that matrix of income statement. Tip number 2 was to build up measure chains and format them. So we needed to start with a measure that's the sum of the total amount. And in the example, in the last tip, I showed it. In the first tip, I showed it using a calculated column. This is a better approach. Rather than using sum of the calculated column, it uses sum x and then puts the calculated column formula in there. So a better approach than having calculated columns because they consume memory in your report. We then took the total amount and put it into an actual. So calculate that where the scenario is actual, and then took that measure, calculated actuals where for the same period last year, depending on whatever period you're looking at now, go back 1 year and show me that period, return that value for that period. Actuals variance to prior years, actuals less prior year actuals, and then the annual growth uses those two to give you a percentage. And as you said, the real power of something like Power BI and DAX is that actually these measures can be shown in their own right. So you can have a chart that just shows the annual growth percentage broken down by region, broken down by date, broken down by anything without having to reference all the rest of these into a single formula or to bring them all into particular things. So really powerful stuff there. And then also we made sure we formatted our measures. So we used, negative numbers in brackets here. And this is a kind of format string that would be used in something like Excel as well. So that gave us our matrix like this, which is single kind of month or year selection. We then wanted our third tip was to say, well, actually, yes, we've got a single month or year selection there. What about if we want to just show month to date, quarter to date, year to date? So the way we did that was created a disconnected table with 3 values in it, Y to D, M to D, Q to D. And then depending on what's selected on there, so this was just a disconnected table in the corner of our data model, depending on what's selected there, that then determines what we return in terms of the measure. So if MTD is selected, we return our actuals in the filter context of dates MTD. If QTD is selected, we select it. We return the value evaluated in the context of dates QTD, and YTD, we do the same thing for there. Then the next tip was having a table with all of our SS lines, including subtotal lines. Now, this was to be able to get our properly formatted income statements, which have subtotals in between them. So the way we did that was to have a running totals actual. So where we have our order is less than our order number. So this is a cumulative total pattern that we applied here, calculating the actuals and making sure we pass in all dim headers to be able to avoid the issue of it not picking up the filter context of this dim headers order. So we need to kind of look at all of these and pick out all of them where the value is less than our current one. And then we had a calc type. So we just said for the calc type, if it's 1, return us our total actuals by period, and 2, running total actuals by period. So this is what we use, this calc type in here, to be able to just determine whether we're showing a running total or we're showing an FS line essentially that's coming from our accounting data. Our last tip that we covered was telling a story with the visuals. So this was all about making sure we provide context to the numbers. So not just showing a number and showing revenue is 154 million, but actually, is that number good or bad? What was it the year before? What was it the month before? Are we going in the right direction with it? Or what? And why is the next question then, right? Why is that good or bad? Which regions are driving that? Which periods are driving that? Which customers are driving that. So here we provided context of numbers. So this is shown in the KPI cards where we've got up-down arrows with some simple conditional formatting. And this is an example of a page on the other tab, which shows a bullet chart. So rather than just showing a bar chart, we've also got the reference target line, which is our prior year. So we can see at a glance, not just that North America operations is the highest effective tax rate, but actually it's also slightly higher than it was last year. So last year it was slightly higher than it was last year, and the same with USA operations. Whereas for European operations, it's the complete opposite. Our prior year was positive, and our effective tax rate this year is negative. So using these to provide context, using visuals, so choosing your visuals carefully. We've then got using color sparingly and to draw attention. So this is the kind of positive change, good or bad. So I was saying on the income statement, we needed to use a bit more complicated measure to be able to work out whether a number going up or down is good or bad, depending on whether it's a revenue or an expense. And that's the measure there on the screen that I've been using to do that. And then we were looking at letting the users ask the why questions through there. So making sure you've got those visual interactions set up right, and you've picked the right combinations of graphs for a page to be able to tell a story with those visual interactions. So here we've got European operations, and it filters the whole region, the whole page for that region. And we have a regional income statement, a regional set of those metrics. And then if we clicked on a particular revenue line, our waterfall chart updates to be able to show that as well. So making sure those visual interactions work. And lastly on that is considering using bookmarks to aid the user experience. So here we had some buttons that show different versions of the different types of the income statement. So whether it's fixed format with those subtotals in there, measure comparison with the drill through, with the plus minus icons, or an actuals where you've got a grid and you've got something along the top and your FS lines along the side. So 3 different layouts of the income statement, which the user is able to flip between using those buttons. And the last tip I wanted to go through was to look at where you might potentially need to start looking at custom visuals or add-ins. And I think they go a really long way with Power BI. They take it to a whole new level that I've not really seen native Power BI getting to in quite a while. So I've been very impressed by some of the stuff I've seen with this. Let me give you a few examples. And by the way, all of the things I'm about to show now, each one of them has a separate webinar on powerplatformfinance.com. So we've done, each of these vendors have come and presented, and we've got the recordings available if you want to find out more details. So the first one was Zebra BI. And here I've just taken an animated GIF that's got his website, and as it shows there, it really highlights the variances, and it does these waterfall charts in a much neater and nicer way than you have to do out of the box. If you see the tip that we did on there, it was slightly hacky to be able to get that to work how we wanted to, whereas it's out of the box with Zebra BI. It's a lot of, it's really bringing out those variances, it's really bringing out the detail, it's using color effectively. And also you can see those charts are responsive. So as you move the size of them up or down and they're able to take up more space, they'll show slightly different things. They'll show more if they can show more, if they have space for it. Really, really good idea. ValQ is a custom visual, and they've also got a kind of right back collaboration side behind it as well. And I like their visual because it's very much around choosing, it's a kind of combination between what if parameters and the decomposition tree. So you could do your kind of scenario modeling that way and then save back some scenarios, and you've got some kind of matrix for planning. You've got a few things in there and scenario comparison. All of this stuff is potentially possible with Power BI to a degree, but it's a lot of work to get to it. And you don't get the same kind of functionality you did. And these are some of the main use cases in finance for traditionally using Excel, is to do that kind of modeling, financial modeling in spreadsheets where you've got the flexibility. But the point is you end up building very bespoke financial models that are unwieldy and are difficult to use, whereas with Power BI you've got the whole controlled environment, you've got the whole service behind it, you've got that integrity, and you've got the ability to be able to take it to a level that Excel you can't go with, even financial modeling spreadsheets. So ValQ is that. Then we've got Power One BI, and this is really about
some really enterprise stuff with write back, real-time write back. So you write back some values in a visual or in your planning forecasts, and you'll see the results straight away because it will go through that pipeline, go through a central database, and come feed back into your Power BI report. And lots of things around pre-populating those forecasts using things like machine learning. Again, can't really do it justice in a minute or so that I'm giving it here, but have a look at their webinars. And we've also got Actress. And one of the things that jumped out at me when we were looking at this was some of the things around where you've got lots of different subsidiaries, each potentially with their own accounting system. One's on Xero, one's on Sage, one's on QuickBooks, and you need to consolidate all that data together, do intercompany reconciliations, all of that. This Actors was very well suited to that kind of process, so it allowed you to have connectors into all those different systems and consolidate them into a single conformed data model. And then it also gave you some ready out-of-the-box logic and visuals, so to do things like intercompany reconciliations, to view profits, to view that with your own data. So those templates also look fantastic. So definitely worth checking out these if you're interested in any of that modeling or planning type activities. And so I think custom visuals is really your way forward with those. You just have to look at there and see what's right for you. There's a summary of those kind of key tips. So use account hierarchy, build up measure chains, show periods dynamically, have a table with all of your lines, including subtotals, tell a story with the visuals, and look at where you can use finance custom visuals or add-ins. And some of the ones we just showed there really take Power BI to that whole new level. Thank you very much for watching. So before we go, here are the links for where you can download the examples. So the income statement, and there's also a video that I did with this and using the same income statement in the next page as well to talk through a role play. With myself playing a Power BI consultant and Amy Boyd from Microsoft playing the role of a finance manager in an organization, and thinking about how to make that transition over from Excel into Power BI and what is the breadth of functionality that's available in Power BI. So yeah, definitely worth a watch if you're interested in this area. And then also that first link there with the PBI income statement is a link to where all of the blogs are that's got the data you can download and this solution at each step. So if you wanted to follow along with any of the stuff we've covered today and maybe a few other things and maybe start from the beginning, then that's the place to go.
Thank you for watching the session. I hope you enjoy the rest of the SQL Bits conference. Please feel free to reach out to me. My contact details on Twitter and LinkedIn are shown here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions and carry on the conversation.